So now we have our CPU covered. We want to move on to a different chipset, which is called our North Bridge, our South Bridge, and our CMOS. Our North Bridge chipset on this computer can be seen here with a heat sink on top of it. Now, what a North Bridge and South Bridge do are the North Bridge and South Bridge essentially are additional communication points for the CPU talking to different parts of the computer. The North Bridge on the computer usually handles memory and graphics and also communication to the South Bridge. The South Bridge controls the input and output controller hub. We have our motherboard and we have our CPU. The CPU will connect with our computer bus to our North Bridge, and this North Bridge chipset will actually connect over to our memory banks. It'll also connect over to our advanced graphics cards. The North Bridge in turn will also control the South Bridge, and the South Bridge chipset will control our input and output, such as our PCI slots and our input and output ports. When we're thinking about upgrading our CPU, we have to make sure that the CPU matches with our North Bridge and South Bridge sets. If we have a motherboard and we're thinking about upgrading it, we've upgraded our memory, and now we want to upgrade our CPU, we can't just upgrade our CPU to whichever the highest and greatest new one out there is that'll match our pins. Because if it's over what our North Bridge and South Bridge can handle, it's not going to give us any improvement. Again, it's always very important to research what your motherboard can handle, research the specifications on your motherboard, and this will give you information about your North Bridge and South Bridge and how that can correspond with your CPU, if you can upgrade your CPU. You aren't going to upgrade the chipsets on your motherboard. The chipsets will usually be seen by, we have our North Bridge chipset here because it's more near the top of our computer, or our motherboard, closer to the CPU, and it has a heat sink on it. And we have our South Bridge chipset down here, which is another one of our large chips. This one does not have a heat sink on it, but it's closer now to our actual PCI slots. These cannot be removed and replaced like the CPU can. The North Bridge and the South Bridge, if we want to upgrade those, we have to upgrade our entire motherboard. Our last chipset is going to be our CMOS. We have our CMOS battery, and then we have our CMOS memory. And these two components store memory changes to the BIOS. These will be located very closely together. We have the CMOS battery, and then we have the BIOS here and the CMOS chipset. In many computers, you can actually remove the BIOS if necessary to flash it with specialized equipment. However, in a previous video, we have talked about how to flash your BIOS if necessary with software.